Welcome to the It's Probably Fine Club. I started this club for all the people who thought something was probably fine, or were told something was probably fine and later discovered it absolutely was not. Today's story is about paperwork, or at least that's what everybody thought it was about. Years ago, I worked at a major research university, and at the time, the university received almost $1 billion a year in federal research funding. Think about that for a second. $1 billion with a B. Scientists were conducting groundbreaking research, cancer research, medical research, engineering research, the kind of work that changes lives. And when you're managing nearly $1 billion a year in federal funding, there are rules, lots of rules, and lots of paperwork. One category of paperwork was something called effort reporting. Now, effort reporting is the system universities use to certify that the salary charged to federal grants matches the work the researchers actually performed. Like a TPS report from the movie Office Space, it wasn't exciting. It wasn't glamorous. It was just one more form people had to complete, and people treated it exactly that way. Then the auditor arrived. At first, nobody seemed especially concerned. Universities get audited all the time. Questions get asked, documents get reviewed, life goes on. Except this audit didn't go that way. The questions kept coming. The review kept expanding. And eventually, it became obvious that something was wrong. One morning, I walked into my boss's office expecting to discuss training or documentation or maybe process improvements. And I asked him what his goals were for this year to make sure we were aligned. And he looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. He said, "My primary goal is to make sure nobody goes to jail." Up until that moment, I thought we were discussing paperwork. Apparently, the Department of Justice thought we were discussing something else. And that got my attention. I remember just staring at him. Jail? When did jail get on the table? For professors? For researchers? World-renowned scientists who were trying to cure diseases? I genuinely struggled to process what he had just said because the issue wasn't embezzlement. It wasn't theft. It wasn't somebody stuffing money into offshore accounts. It was effort reporting, filling out forms, certifications, paperwork. And yet somehow we were talking about possible jail for professors. Eventually, I learned more about what had happened. The audit had escalated. Concerns had been reported to the Department of Justice, and what began as an administrative review was now being treated as a potential criminal fraud case. And that's when I realized I didn't fully understand the problem. The strange thing was that many of the professors didn't fully understand it either, not because they weren't intelligent, quite the opposite. Some of the smartest people I ever met in my life worked at that university. Many had been conducting federally funded research for decades, and many genuinely believed they were filling out the forms correctly. The DOJ's position was essentially that good intentions didn't matter if the forms were inaccurate. The problem was that some of the professors were answering a very different question from the one the federal government was asking. The professors were often thinking in terms of hours, while the government was thinking in percentages, which means the maximum you could work is 100%. Some professors were basing their percentage effort on a 40-hour work week. So working 20 hours a week on a project would be considered 50% effort. Except if you do that on 3 projects, because you're actually working 60 hours a week, then your effort adds up to 150%. Now, to the professors, that made sense because they were thinking in hours, but the government wasn't asking how many hours a week did you work on this grant. The government was asking, what percentage of your total professional effort was devoted to this activity? And under that framework, your total professional effort is always 100%, no matter how many hours a week you work. In fact, I had experienced the same confusion myself years earlier. Before I worked in research administration, I taught a law school class as an adjunct professor. At the end of the year, I had to complete an effort reporting certification. I'd never seen one before, so I asked the dean how to fill it out. She told me, incorrectly, that a full-time professor taught 4 classes and that since I taught 1 class, I should certify 25% effort. That sounded perfectly reasonable, so that's what I did. And years later, I learned it was wrong. That is not how effort reporting works. Teaching that one class represented 100% of my total university effort because it was the only thing I was doing for the university. The dean wasn't trying to mislead me. I wasn't trying to certify anything inaccurately. We both thought we understood the form. Looking back, what struck me was that the incorrect certification actually worked against the law school's financial interests. If anyone had understood the salary reimbursement implications correctly, they would have wanted me to certify 100%, not 25%. That's how deeply misunderstood these forms were. Eventually, we started conducting training sessions, and that's how I knew the misunderstanding was real, because some of the professors argued with us, and others asked a lot of questions, not because they were dishonest, not because they were trying to cheat, but because they genuinely believed they'd been doing it right. They've been doing it this way for years, sometimes decades. And because of the confusion, we eventually started putting pie charts into presentations, actual pie charts and pictures of pizzas, because that was the most effective way to convey the concept. I can still remember one line from the training. Okay, imagine your professional effort is a pie. And suddenly people would see it. The slices had to add up to the whole pie. The pie couldn't be 125%. The pie was the pie, which is 100% of a pie, which sounds obvious now, but it wasn't obvious then. And to be honest, it felt a little ridiculous. Here we were standing in front of the smartest people I'd ever met, explaining pie charts. And I remember thinking, how did we get here? But the more we talked about it, the more I realized the problem wasn't intelligence. The problem was assumptions. What fascinated me wasn't that some people misunderstood the concept. What fascinated me was how long the misunderstanding had survived. For decades, these weren't inexperienced people. These were accomplished researchers, and many of them had never stopped to question whether they understood the certification they were signing. The university eventually settled the matter with the DOJ for nearly $20 million. One of the conditions of the settlement was that no criminal charges would be filed. Think about that for a second. We had gone from effort reporting to pie charts to a settlement valued at millions of dollars and including protections against criminal prosecution. That's how serious the situation had become. One thing I realized from this whole thing was that experience and understanding are not the same thing. Sometimes experience makes us wiser, but sometimes experience makes us certain, and certainty can be dangerous when we're wrong. That's why this story belongs in the It's Probably Fine Club, because nobody woke up intending to commit fraud. People were operating under assumptions they had held for years that felt completely reasonable. They thought they understood it. Nobody stopped to ask whether their assumptions were correct. Everybody thought it was probably fine until one day they discovered otherwise. So, for all new and existing members of the It's Probably Fine Club, have you ever discovered that something you'd been doing for years wasn't actually being done the way it should be? Leave it in the comments below. And remember, the details matter more than people think they do. I'll see you next time.